My Lords, during the Easter recess, we lost one of the most remarkable members of this House, Lord Callaghan of Cardiff. I rise to pay tribute to him, and I'm deeply proud to do so. As well as being a former Prime Minister, he held the distinction of having held all 4 of the great offices of state, something I think noble lords will agree is unlikely to be repeated. It's difficult to improve upon the tributes paid to him last week by Prime Ministers past and present. Sir Edward Heath said, "We have lost a major figure from our political landscape." The noble lady Baroness Thatcher described him as a formidable opponent. And my noble friend the Prime Minister spoke of a giant of the Labour movement. He worked tirelessly to put into action the values of social justice, solidarity and opportunity for all, which brought him into politics and the Labour Party. But the noble Lord Callaghan was more than a political heavyweight. He was also a loving father, grandfather and great-grandfather, a beloved husband and a cherished friend. As noble lords will know, Lord Callaghan's wife of 67 years, Audrey, died just a few days before he did. We all remember his selfless devotion to her. Our thoughts are, of course, with the family at this difficult time, and I know that I speak for the whole House when I say that we are thinking in particular of their daughter, my noble friend, Baroness J of Paddington. Leonard James Callaghan was born in Portsmouth in 1912. The son of a Royal Naval Chief Petty Officer, his father died when James was just 9. He was educated at Portsmouth Northern Grammar School, and in 1929 he joined the civil service as a clerk in an inland revenue office in Maidstone. It was around this time that he met Audrey and also became a trade unionist, joining the Labour Party in 1931. Having become a full-time union official with the Inland Revenue Staff Federation, he volunteered with the Royal Navy during the Second World War, serving with the East Indies Fleet and later being commissioned as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. After the war, Lord Callaghan's political career stepped up a pace. His 42-year association with the parliamentary seat of Cardiff South began when he was elected to Parliament in Labour's landslide election victory in 1945. By 1947, he had been promoted to the front bench as Parliamentary Secretary for Transport. He subsequently served the Acton government as Parliamentary and Financial Secretary to the Admiralty, and although Labour returned to opposition in 1951, his career continued to flourish as a front bench spokesperson. When Harold Wilson's government was formed in 1964, he was named Chancellor of the Exchequer. In this capacity, he introduced corporation and capital gains taxes, but he left the Exchequer in 1967 when he was forced to devalue the pound, moving to become Home Secretary in a straight swap with the late Lord Jenkins. He was a well-regarded Home Secretary, winning admirers on all sides. With the situation in Northern Ireland taking up much of his time, he was described by my noble friend Lord Healy as having dealt with the issue with incomparable skill and understanding, both on the spot and in Westminster. During his period at the Home Office, he also introduced the Race Relations Act, but defeat for Labour in the 1970 election meant another period in opposition. In Harold Wilson's second government in 1974, Lord Callaghan became Foreign Secretary, working on such issues as world poverty and Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe. Topics very familiar to this House today. In 1975, he played a key role in the referendum on membership of the European Community, and when Harold Wilson resigned in 1976, he was the favourite to succeed him. So it was on April the 5th, 1976, that James Callaghan became Prime Minister, apparently exclaiming at the time, "Prime Minister, and I never went to university." His period at number 10 was a challenging time. With the economy in trouble, his government had to secure the passage of unpopular cuts in government spending. His political skills were such that he was able to persuade a majority of his cabinet to support his Chancellor, my noble friend Lord Healey, who later praised the consummate skill with which he handled the cabinet. And Lord Callaghan was popular with the people. His candid, straight-speaking appealed to them, and he oversaw a revival in Labour's fortunes. As we know, it wasn't enough, and in March 1979, his government was brought down by a vote of no confidence. Lord Callaghan remained Labour leader in opposition for 18 months, and in 1983 became Father of the House. He retired from the House of Commons in 1987, was appointed a Knight of the Garter in April, and created a life peer. My lords, I know that we will all agree that this snapshot of Lord Callaghan's life cannot fully reflect a fully and truly remarkable life. He was passionate about his politics, not least about the right to a decent education, but he was also tough, practical, a calm leader, vastly experienced, and very candid. My lords, with Lord Callaghan's passing, this house has lost a great man. A man who served his country with distinction, but who was also a family man. I do not think we shall see his like again.
My lords, it is a privilege to follow the noble Baroness, the leader of the House, in her just tribute to the late Lord Callaghan of Cardiff. People will remember Lord Callaghan, above all, as a decent, patriotic, commonsensical man, ready to tell uncomfortable truths if needed and to face the consequences if he believed the cause was right. My lords, the public instinctively liked and respected the man they knew as Jim. There will be millions in the Wales he loved and right across Britain who heard of his death with great sadness. In the age of modern politics, of focus groups, image and spin, his straightforward qualities seem to recall another era. Lord Callaghan was in Parliament for well nigh 60 years, 42 as a Member of Parliament for Cardiff South. And as the noble Baroness, the leader of the House, said, he was the only person ever to hold the four great offices of state: Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister. That, my lords, is a record unlikely ever to be equalled. In all those offices, he faced enormous challenges. In the 1960s, a struggle for the pound, which ended in devaluation against a background of relative economic decline, and in the 1970s, renegotiation of our relationship with the EU. But in good times and bad, he conducted himself with great political skill and integrity, never more perhaps than when he took a difficult decision to commit troops to Northern Ireland, or when, far ahead of most in the Labour movement, he saw that Britain could not spend its way out of problems and that wages could not run ahead of increases in national prosperity. This realization, and his typically blunt statement of it, framed his term as Prime Minister. My lords, it was when he eventually fell from government, it was a sad end to a period in which he served this country with great distinction as Prime Minister, not least because he realized the limitations on that office and did not try to backseat drive every part of government. My lords, Lord Callaghan did not join us in this House until 1987, but we miss him and his wise interventions from his usual place in this House. And many on all sides of the House had good reason to be grateful for his kindness and the voice of his unparalleled experience. Not least, my lords, in legislation on the Copyright Designs and Patents Act in the late 1980s, when he championed and was successful in getting the government to agree to an amendment to extend the copyright on Peter Pan to the benefit of the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital. My lords, Lord Callaghan knew great poverty in childhood and great distinction in old age, but it did not change him. He held by lifelong principles. He dealt as he found, meant what he said, and said what he meant. He loved this country. He served so faithfully in war and peace. The last Prime Minister, we must all hope, ever to serve in wartime. He loved the countryside and his beloved farm in Sussex, and his families, and the values that go with that, living to relish grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and supported by all his family, not least the noble Baroness, Lady J. of Paddington, to whom the whole House will extend the sincerest sympathy. My lords, that sympathy is the deeper because of the recent loss also of Lady Callaghan, to whom I add my own tribute. Together they shared some 67 years of married life and were separated in death by just 11 days. Lady Callaghan, too, had a deep well of goodness, decency, humanity, and sincerity. In these qualities, Lord and Lady Callaghan were two sides of the same coin. The metal of that coin was gold. This house and this country will long remember them.
My Lord, the Lord President and the Leader of the Opposition have very eloquently expressed memories of Lord Callaghan as a statesman, as the House magazine heads him today. Looking round this House, I'm well aware that we also mourn him today as a colleague and a friend. I had the honour of working for Lord Callaghan for 9 years as his political secretary. I never liked the term political advisor. I thought it was absurd, rather like saying that you were dancing advisor to Nijinsky or golfing advisor to Jack Nicklaus. I preferred political secretary, but it was 9 wonderful years of my life. I always remember that he had a massive fund of Hugh Dalton stories. And I remember saying to him, you realise in 30 years' time, I will have a whole fund of Jim Callaghan stories. Oh, no, he said, no, Dalton was a giant. But of course, as the Prime Minister so rightly said, so was Jim Callaghan. And perhaps I can just give a little flavour of not only what an honour it was to work for him, but just what good fun. In the early 70s, we went together to Vietnam, and we had to meet with President Thieu, then President of South Vietnam, and something of a controversial figure both in his own country and here back in Britain. And after the meeting, we had a press conference, and Mr. Callaghan, as he then was asked by the South Vietnamese press what he thought of President Thieu. He said he would make an excellent member of the National Executive of the Labour Party. This satisfied the South Vietnamese press, who did not probe him further about his opinion of the National Executive of the Labour Party. I also remember going with him during those renegotiations on Europe, and the meeting had started sometime in the morning, and as those European meetings tend to do, it went long into the evening, and at about 11 o'clock, Mr. Callaghan signalled that he wished to speak, and he was called by the chairman. And he opened with an absolute eulogy of his Minister of State, Mr. now Lord Hattersley. He praised Mr. Hattersley's eloquence, his grasp of his brief, his shrewdness, his toughness, and his ability. And then he concluded, and that is why I have every confidence that I can now go to bed and leave I could go on. There are hundreds of them, I can assure you. But what did strike me as well was that, and not only from the Labour side of the House, there were others on all sides of the House, but he was part of that generation who had been scarred by the 30s and then the horrors of the Second World War, and who came back to win the peace and saying never again. And those experiences, I think, very much formed his political life. And he was a politician. I think that's the other thing. And sometimes people find politician as a rather pejorative term. He was a politician in every sense. He knew how to take knocks and to give them. And he didn't find smoke-filled rooms overly oppressive. He knew how to work the machine, and he saw nothing wrong, because politics for him was for a purpose. I think, trying to pick out things in that career, as I knew them, I will say that the IMF negotiations that were referred to, I think when the papers are published, it will be a case study of what good cabinet government should be. And I think he immensely strengthened cabinet government and its process during his time in office. The only other thing I would say about him, coupled with the name of Lord Whitelaw, during the first election of '74, I was travelling the country, the marginals, with Jim Callaghan in a rather large limousine that the Co-op funeral service had provided us. And we stopped somewhere in the East Midlands for a cup of tea at a hotel. And about 2 or 3 minutes later, in came Willie Whitelaw with a protection officer and one other. We all travelled with smaller entourages in those days. And Jim got up and walked across, and then he came back to me. He said, "I hope you don't mind." He says, "But Willie and I are just going to have a pot of tea together." And I've often thought, when people think of the rivalry of politics, that in the midst of a rather bitter and divisive election, these two great statesmen were sat in the corner of an English hotel having a pot of tea and talking together before they went off to their respective campaigns. And in a way, Willie also ends this tribute, because I've got many memories of him, but one will be on that bench just after I came into the House in 1976. The Conservatives were in trouble on the Broadcasting Act. And Lord Whitelaw didn't come often to the House in those days, but he did come for a very crucial debate and a very crucial vote. And he made an impassioned speech from those benches up there in support of the government position. And he sat down to general approval, and Lord Callaghan stood up, and he pursed his lips, and he looked around for quite some time, and then he said, "Well, we always know when they're in trouble, don't we?" And he had the House with him. I think, actually, reading all the tributes, strangely enough, it was his old nemesis, Mrs. Thatcher, who got it right, because he was a patriot, and he was a parliamentarian, and he's somebody I'll miss very much.
My Lords, on behalf of the crossbench peers, I join in the warm tributes to the late Lord Callaghan of Cardiff. His was indeed a very remarkable achievement, not only to have been Prime Minister at a very difficult period in the nation's affairs, but also during a long life at the heart of national government, to have held the major offices of state as Chancellor of the Exchequer, Home Secretary and Foreign Secretary. It demonstrates his capacity to command not only the support of the British public, but also of his political colleagues covering a wide range of different views within a system of cabinet government. Not an easy task. I sometimes think that we don't have much foresight in public life, but recently I think we may not have too much good also at hindsight, for we should recall that during much of his life of the highest offices of state, Lord Callaghan faced serious difficulties, in particular those resulting from the weakness of the economy, which could not be turned round quickly, and his achievements must be seen in that context. What decisions could have been more difficult in the circumstances of that time than the value of the currency, the defence of the prices and incomes policy, serious problems of security in Northern Ireland and the protection of the interests of the communities there, or the timing of decisions on immigration from East Africa, or the timing of the renegotiation referendum on Europe. They were indeed difficult decisions on which he took important responsibilities. I was in the British public service during much of the time that Lord Callaghan held power, and he was a very firm believer in the integrity and independence of the civil service, both in practice and later in powerful speeches in this House. I believe strongly then, as I do now, in Lord Callaghan's commitment to public service and the national interest, and as crossbenchers who are independent of politics and don't even have a vote in the general election, and in the presence of Lady J, we honour that commitment today.
Well done. If I may, to associate the Bishop's Bench with the tributes that have been paid by all sides of the House today. We have heard and read little in recent days of the substantial and controversial matters of state with which Lord Callaghan engaged in his long and distinguished career. On these benches, we recall a matter of state and controversy of our own, and Lord Callaghan's robust defence of his right as Prime Minister to choose diocesan bishops. He did so in the face of the General Synod of the Church of England's resolution that the Church should have the decisive voice. The Prime Minister told the other place that as archbishops and bishops sit in this chamber, our nomination remains a matter for the Prime Minister's concern. However, he proceeded to work with the late Lord Callaghan, then Archbishop of Canterbury, and the late Sir Norman Anderson to negotiate a compromise. And the 1976 Concordat Agreement between Church and State survives in large part to this day as one example of a relationship which is both enduring and evolving. Of more human interest, we have learned, of course, a little of that great strength of partnership between Jim and Audrey Callaghan, which began when they met as Sunday school teachers all those years ago. We're also aware of the unwavering devotion with which he cared for Audrey as she slipped away into the shadows of her illness, a devotion which is both an inspiration and, I believe, an example to us all. And I offer from this bench my prayers and condolences to the noble lady, Baroness J, to Julia, Michael, who have lost not just one but both parents in such a very short period of time, and to the rest of the wider family.
I would like to speak rather briefly about one facet of Jim Callaghan's life. He was always interested in things maritime, as one might expect from somebody who was born in Portsmouth. But after his service in the Royal Navy, he formed the Advisory Committee on Pollution of the Sea in 1952. And he remained interested in ACOPS, as it became known, until days before his death, when he recommended his son, Michael, to be a member of the Executive Committee of ACOPS. I think that was utterly remarkable. And I was very proud to serve as a minister in his government. I thought he was a great Prime Minister. And then as chairman and later as president of ACOPS itself. our thoughts go out to all his family, and in particular to our former leader of the government party, Margaret. I liked Jim. I thought he was a wonderful human being. He had faults, of course. He even thought that my playing of golf was reprehensible, as he indicated to my wife on the telephone. One of the things which I most remember about him was that every 3 or 4 months, junior ministers, ministers of state, parliamentary undersecretaries were convened in a meeting which he chaired. And you could talk about anything except your own department. And all in all, I thought that he was a wonderful human being. And we, in this house, will certainly miss him. And I convey my belief that in his partnership in marriage, which was perfect, he always thought about Audrey. Margaret, we think of you at this moment.
Although so much has already been said about the noble Lord Callaghan, I wonder if I may just add a few words, because he and I were both elected to the other house in 1945. We were elected to different parties, but, and I can't remember how exactly was it that it happened, we became friends at an early stage. And I must say, I thought he was a very likable man. And he turned out to be a very open-minded man. I was a political opponent, but he always wanted to know what views one had and what one's friends had. And I really do feel that over the years, his mind broadened by taking in as much information as he could from not only his parliamentary friends, but his political opponents. Of course, there was one thing that brought us rather close together when we'd been in Parliament just a few years, and that was our common interest in transport. I held a humble position as Secretary to the Conservative Transport Committee when he became Parliamentary Secretary to the Ministry of Transport. And far from that turning us into controversial political opponents, it brought us closer together. And privately, he would very often ask my opinion about one thing or another to do with transport. Then, over the many years, I grew in greater admiration for him, because the great variety of responsibilities that were placed upon him with his various parliamentary offices meant that he had to open his mind still further and adapt his mind as was required. He never failed in any of the important posts to which he was given responsibility. He was greatly admired right across the House of Commons at that time, and I've no doubt in your Lordship's House. I take the liberty of paying my tribute because when he departed, he and I were the longest serving members of both houses. We had both been here for nearly 60 years. Mind you, there are two hereditary peers who have served in Parliament even longer my noble friend Lord Jellicoe, who has today, I'm glad to say, his 87th birthday. Nice young fellow. And then there's Lord Paddington as well. But it's also been, for those of us who knew Jim Callaghan from the start of his parliamentary life, a great joy to have his daughter here. One doesn't always agree with her, but one is glad that she is here and admires her efforts. My Lord, may I just conclude by saying this, that in my long life, I have found that not only was Jim Callaghan one of the most interesting men that I've known and one of the most friendly men, but he was one of those conscientious men who wanted to obtain other people's opinions to a very great extent. And, of course, finally, I was delighted when we became close enough friends for him and Lady Callaghan to attend 2 charitable concerts which I had organised. In Parliament, over the many years that so many of us have been here, there's been a lot of talent. People have varied enormously. But of all those that we have known, few have reached the distinctions of one kind and another that he did, and fulfilled them so much in the national interest.
My lords, the last proper conversation I had with Lord Callaghan was at the long table. During lunch, he said, "You know, when you reach my age, all that really matters are the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren." And I thought, how wonderful it must be to be really grown up.
Lords, I would like to say very briefly a few words because I had the privilege of writing Lord Callaghan's biography. It occupied... occupied 8 years of my life, and it was, I think, the most interesting thing that I've ever done. It was a biography, not an autobiography. He was a very strong man to talk to, a very tough man. If somebody has written their own autobiography, which is no doubt what I had in my mind, you have to kind of jolt them or unsettle them in some way, and that could be quite an exciting event. I recall immigration and devolution as 2 topics which produced a certain amount of excitement. But he was also a very, very human man, and a man very aware of his own experiences, which gave him a great depth of sympathy with the sufferings of others, including, I may say, myself and my children when I was writing the book. He was very much aware of someone who had lost his own parent at a young age. He was a very complex man. He had a great range of interests and experiences. One of his interests being rugby football. He played in the second row of Streatham. He was very proud of that, and I'm happy to say when he talked about rugby football, he spoke about we, and he meant the Welsh rugby team and not the English rugby team. He was a man with roots. He was rooted in Portsmouth. He was rooted in nonconformity, in the Navy, in the trade unions, in the Labour Party, in his country. He was very interested in British history. He liked talking about British history. He liked talking about the history of the Navy in particular. He was interested in the fact that one of my descendants fought at Trafalgar, which is of some current concern. But he was a man whose ideas could evolve and grow with events, and that was true in his views on Europe, his views on Northern Ireland and many other topics. He was in many ways, I think, a conservative man, a cautious man, but a man also who could take quite extraordinary and dramatic leaps in executive action. So I think of him as a very big man, and the bigger the person that I spoke to, the more the respect they had was for Lord Callaghan. I came across a phrase from Robert Blatchford, famous socialist editor, on William Morris: strike at him where you would, he rang true. I think Jim Callaghan always rang true, and I mourn his memory.
My Lords, this has been a very proud afternoon for me, and I'm profoundly grateful to your Lordships for the warm tributes and wonderful memories which you've expressed from every side of the House. I think you've rightly reflected the extraordinarily full and indeed fulfilled life that both of my parents shared and enjoyed over such a long period. And as you can imagine, over the last week, all of my family have received some extraordinary letters from all over this country and indeed from all over the world. They've ranged from letters and greetings from international statesmen to the Ukrainian parents of a young student who studied engineering at Swansea University, a child of Chernobyl, as he was called, whom my father quietly supported there. And as my noble friend Lord Carter has reminded me this afternoon, I mustn't forget the condolences from the organisers of the Sussex Ploughing Championships, because as he rightly reminded me, my father's greatest prize amongst many was often the fact that he won the local wheat growing championship. But of course, my lords, it's in this chamber and in another place that his political life has been centred, as noble lords have recalled, for 60 years. And for 60 years, the Palace of Westminster has been a second home. And so it is as parliamentarians that he would particularly value and be very pleased to have heard the wonderful things that you have said. As you know, and as noble lords have referred this afternoon, it was concern for my mother that kept him from his familiar place on this bench over the last few years of this Parliament. Nevertheless, you were never far from his thoughts. He read the government whip every week, he studied Hansard assiduously, and often cross-questioned me about the individual speakers. And I think it would be fair to say that as time went on, his judgments of performance became slightly more mellow. He was immensely touched when last February the House noted that he had become the longest living ex-Prime Minister. His interest, I think, in international affairs, especially in Africa, is something that's been referred to, and it was always very active and involved. And in the very last batch of letters that he and I chatted about on the day before he died was a report from the Parliamentary Zambia Trust, which had sent to him a newsletter recalling a visit that he had made to the Central African Federation in 1957, which he had written to them about. And my noble friend Lady Amos will be pleased to hear that even in 1957 he was urging the improved education of women in Zambia. But, my lords, as many of you know, my father never lived in the past. He was already in the last few weeks talking about how he would come on the opening day of the next Parliament to take the oath. He was looking forward to a good crop of raspberries in his Sussex garden in July. Tomorrow, as noble lords have mentioned, will be April the 5th. It may be the beginning of a new general election campaign. It will mark the 29th anniversary of the day that he became Prime Minister. And I hope that tomorrow, and indeed in the future, we will all remember one of his most often quoted remarks: "You may never reach the promised land, but you can certainly march towards it." My lords, thank you very much.
The Lord Peyton of Yeovil.
My lords, I beg leave to ask the question, standing my name on the order